the whole history of coca and cocaine, I think, is probably the best example we could find of what you should not do with one of these drug plants. We came to South America, where the Spanish did, saw Indians chewing coca. Their immediate reaction was that this was something satanic and horrible, and they tried to stamp it out. They quickly found that they couldn't do that, in particular that if they wanted Indians to work for them in their mines, they had to give them coca. So then they began to tax coca and take control over it. But they never tried it themselves. Again, they saw this as a dirty habit of people who they considered subhuman, and they didn't try it themselves, even though Indians told them that this was a superior remedy and very good for the constitution and helpful with altitude sickness and so forth. It took remarkably long time before European scientists took any interest in coca. Really not until the middle 1800s. And then very shortly after they did, a German scientist isolated cocaine from the leaf. And cocaine was released to the world as the active essence of coca that embodied all of its principles. So research on coca leaf stopped, and everyone began experimenting with cocaine. And as you know, in the 1880s, cocaine was widely promoted by the medical profession as a cure-all for everything. And widespread addiction followed in the wake of that. So this was entirely medically created. And then when there was a great public outcry about the harmfulness of cocaine, the medical profession took the position, as it has in many instances since then, that it was not their fault, that the problem was that the drug itself was bad, with no redeeming qualities, and that the ultimate source of the badness was the plant itself. So cocaine was banned, instantly creating a black market for it. And now we're at the other end of this, where our society is now relentlessly involved with trying to eradicate coca in South America and prevent Indians from using it, because we blew it.
So, to the rescue, once again, the greatest ethnobotanist of this century, Richard Evans Schultes of Harvard University, who's dedicated his whole life to understanding how American Indians use plants. Richard Evans Schultes sent his best student, the late Timothy Plowman, to South America to study the plant Erythroxylon coca. In his much-praised book, One River, the anthropologist Wade Davis has written about both men.
Tim Plowman was Schultes' protege. I once asked Mrs. Schultes whether Tim had been as close as a son to the great professor, and she shook her head and said no, closer than a son. Tim was the world's expert on coca. In the early 1970s, Schultes sort of managed to do the impossible, secure from the U.S. government $250,000 to study this plant known as the divine leaf of immortality, and of course the notorious source of cocaine. And even though the cartel was emerging, and even though the efforts to eradicate the fields had been underway for over 50 years at that point, astonishing little was known about coca. Nobody knew how many species yielded the alkaloid. Nobody knew anything about the pharmacology of coca chewing. Nobody had even done a nutritional study of the plant, even though it had not only been maligned by physicians, but it was something that was consumed every day by literally millions of South American Indians. And so on a journey made possible by Schultes, inspired by him and certainly infused at all times with his spirit, Timothy and I traveled the length and breadth of South America, studying the ethnobotany and the taxonomy of this most wondrous plant of the Inca. And what we found was really quite amazing. I mean, at one level, coca symbolized the very fabric of Andean life. There was no gesture that could be begun without some kind of use of the coca leaf. When you met people on the trail, you didn't shake hands, you traded leaves. Distances were measured in the Andes not in miles or kilometers, but in coca chews. There were societies where the entire societal ideal was to abstain from sex, eating, and sleeping, and do nothing but chew the sacred leaves and chant to the ancestors. There were coca diviners who read the future in the venation of the leaves, a skill that could only be possessed by someone who had successfully survived a lightning strike. And the Inca themselves, unable to cultivate the plant at the elevation of the imperial capital of Cusco, had actually replicated it in gold and silver leaf in fields that colored the landscape. And when we did the first nutritional study of the plant, what Tim found was rather astonishing. It turned out that coca, yes, it had a small amount of cocaine in it, 0.5 to 1% dry weight, roughly analogous to the amount of caffeine in a coffee bean. Amount of cocaine absorbed in a very mild and natural form through the mouth, in a slow fashion that left it completely benign, a mild stimulant in a harsh environment. But what Tim also found in the plant, much to the regret, I think, of our backers of the U.S. government, was it turned out that this plant was just chock full of vitamins. Not only was it full of vitamins, it had more calcium in it than any plant that had ever been studied by the USDA, which made it perfect for the diet of the Andes that traditionally lacked a milk product, particularly for women that were nursing. It also turned out to have enzymes in it which enhanced the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, which made it perfect, of course, for the traditional potato crop diet of the Andes. So in one single gesture of research, if you will, Tim showed that this plant was a benign stimulant that in 4,000 years of being used by Indian peoples and all the pre-Columbian civilizations of South America, in the Andes rather, had never shown any evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, and that it was a fundamental part of the nutritional regime of the people themselves. So this plant that had been so maligned was revealed to be what it was, the true divine leaf of immortality. And this revelation, in some sense, put into stark contrast the draconian efforts financed and organized and promoted by the U.S. government that certainly persist even more so today than they did 20 years ago, to poison the coca fields with all the various herbicides and insecticides that today pollute the headwater rivers of the Mother Amazon herself.
By the way, I think it's also worth noting that our drug policies, which in the U.S. began about 1914 with the passage of the Harrison Narcotics Act, which mentioned cocaine, have directly led to the disappearance of coca and coca products from our world, while encouraging an ever-expanding black market in cocaine, which is easy to smuggle. I mean, nobody's going to smuggle coca leaves, which are bulky and have very low amounts of the drug, and everybody's going to try to smuggle this concentrated white powder, which is worth so much money. So I think our drug laws and drug policies have directly contributed to the wave of abuse that we have by driving out of circulation the natural form of the drug, which has a much lower abuse potential, and encouraging commerce in this isolated chemical, which has a very high potential for abuse.
And therefore encouraging gangsterdom, criminality, and violence.
All of it. As I said, it's a real object lesson in what not to do when you encounter a drug plant in the world. I think the history of coca and cocaine provides the best illustration of all the things that we've done wrong, culminating now, as I said, with our attempts to prevent natives in South America from using their sacred leaf.